Welcome to Wonkistan, Election Edition.
Since Wonkistan began in September, we've been having a blog-based conversation about voting and what it means, including video contributions from our friends Rowan, Catherine, and Hussein.
Questions we've been pondering include, is it ever acceptable not to vote?
Should we still vote for a candidate if we find some of his major policies strongly objectionable?
Is merely voting against a candidate too cynical a gesture?
Is a vote for a third party a wasted vote?
These questions and more have been challenging our assumptions about democracy and civic duty.
We don't claim to have easy answers for you, but what we can do is provide context for the many opinions on voting, and give room to some of the perspectives and opinions that would otherwise be drowned out. That's what we're doing today.
We discussed strategic voting, protest voting, and third-party voting quite a lot in Wonkistan, but one option we haven't covered too much because it's pretty sensitive: deliberately and thoughtfully choosing not to vote at all.
On the eve of the general election, I sat down with my friend and former roommate Andrew, who doesn't plan to vote. First of all, I asked him where this conviction comes from.
Why am I not voting? I think the most honest answer to that is because Dorothy Day told me not to. That's not really true, and I have to explain who she is. Dorothy Day was the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, which began in the early 20th century, and was essentially a movement of lay people within Catholic circles to essentially provide hospitality to the poor.
I showed him Hank Green's video entitled "You Must Vote," which oversimplifies the plethora of options available to voters. Andrew says that insisting on voting as the ultimate expression of citizen civic duty is restricting and ultimately unconstructive.
What I'm objecting to is the objection to people choosing not to vote. Voting is not the only action you can take politically or socially to do something in the world. The objection to people not participating in the voting process as a sort of neglect of your responsibility in society is limiting, I think, the scope to which we are able to participate in the political process.
As a Catholic, Andrew realizes that people have a social responsibility toward one another. As the venerable 4th century Saint Basil the Great said, "The coat hanging unused in your closet belongs to the man who needs it." Thus, for Andrew, voting is a way of excusing yourself from your direct responsibility to serve the needy around you.
If I have someone in front of me with a need that I'm not willing to personally meet, and I say, but instead I am willing to cast a vote for a system in DC who is going to solve a systemic problem for you, and therefore I'm sort of directly doing something for you, but not directly.
Naming voting one's civic duty makes service to the poor, the downtrodden, and the neglected seem merely optional.
The fulfillment of your responsibility can take many different forms, and I think that's what's important to keep in mind. There should always be ideals, but not to put limits on what is an acceptable carrying out of your civic responsibility. When you essentially make an assertion, or you take an action or refuse to take an action, you are communicating an ideal. And I think the only situation in which that becomes completely meaningless is if you keep it to yourself.
Andrew brings up the value of direct face-to-face conversation between people, something Catholic workers call clarification of thought. This, he argues, is more powerful than a representative indirect act like voting.
It can be as simple as something like you and me sitting together and sort of talking about different issues and challenging one another on those things. And I think Dorothy and Peter were very fond of that sort of a system. They called it, clarification of thought, that you would sit together at a table in mutual recognition of differences and agreements, and you sort of work towards, at the very least, an understanding of one another's ideas and motivations. And that in itself is a powerful process, and I think it's many times undervalued. The goal is to start what Dorothy called a revolution of the heart. When you take a position and you're willing to share that position with others and be challenged on that position and to challenge others on the foundations of their position, that's when you get this process of transformation and social revolution that can't happen, I don't think, when we rely specifically on two major parties or even several smaller parties in that mix to build the conversation for us.
For Andrew, in practice, the work he can accomplish between people as an activist in society is far more important than the symbolic choice he might make between two unsatisfactory leaders.
We can argue about whether activists should vote as well, but the point here is that informed, deliberate abstinence from voting doesn't amount to giving up on social and political reform. The vote no matter what narrative makes this seem like an irresponsible choice, but for Andrew anyway, not voting is the more responsible option.
We want to thank Andrew for taking the time to articulate his position for us. Voting, or not, is a very personal thing, and we appreciate him talking about it on camera.
Thanks also to Hank Green, whose You Must Vote video, though too straightforward in our opinion, sparked a really valuable and robust discussion in our community as well as many others.
Whatever you do tomorrow, Wonkistanis of the United States, let it be informed and deliberate.
We'll see you for election night nail-biting on Twitter, and as always on Wonkistan.com.